Good evening. In celebration of Women's History Month, we're proud to delve into the work of Melinda Lopez, one of the most accomplished Cuban American playwrights of her generation. Ms. Lopez will be introduced and interviewed by Isabel Alvarez Borland, Distinguished Professor Emerita of Arts and Humanities in the Department of Spanish at the College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts. Her books include Cuban American Literature of Exile, From Person to Persona, and Discontinuidad y Ruptura en Guillermo Cabrera Infante. Her essays on Cuban and Latin American literature have appeared in numerous scholarly journals such as Hispanic Review, MLN, and Revista Iberoamericana. She is currently Associate Editor of Hispania and a member of the Board of Directors of the Cuban Cultural Center of New York. Please join me in welcoming Isabel Alvarez Borland and Melinda Lopez.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank the Cuban Cultural Center for giving me the honor of interviewing Melinda Lopez, a friend. I have known Melinda for a while. One day I received a call from the Huntington Theater when she was presenting a play called Becoming Cuba. And they asked me if I would participate in the discussion after the play. And that's where I met Melinda that night. And since then, we had a pretty close relationship because I would invite her to Holy Cross to see my students. I was a teacher at Holy Cross, and Melinda participated with my classes. And then one time, Holy Cross invited her, and our relationship has been great, and she has always been very generous, very generous. Then she did a second play, well after Yerma, and also invited me to talk to the audience when you did that adaptation of Yerma. That was fantastic. Whatever I can say about Melinda, she's always been there for me, and she's here today, so I thank her. I'll say a little bit about her background, and then she will add what she's done since the pandemic, because that's where we got a little bit disconnected. She is a playwright, an actress, a university professor who resides in the Boston area. She's one of the Mellon Foundation National Playwright residents with the Huntington Theater Company. She's still with them, right, Melinda?
Yes.
And she was a 2019 Mass Cultural Council Fellow in Dramatic Writing. She's the daughter of Cuban exiles who left Cuba for Colombia and then came to the United States in the 1960s, where they settled in Bedford. It's a very close community to Boston. While her plays include a variety of subjects and themes, it is her work about Cuba that has received in the Boston area wide acclaim. Her principal plays on Cuba are Sonia Flew, Sonia Se Fue was translated, that she presented in 2004. And then in 2014, in between she did many things, but I'm just talking about the Cuban things. Becoming Cuba in 2014. And then the latest thing that has had to do with Cuba, but it's more intimate, is her play Mala. And here's Melinda to tell us a little bit about what she has been doing that I have skipped. And I have skipped all of her awards. She is very well recognized and has gotten several awards for each one of these plays that I have mentioned. Her work is truly amazing. Okay, Melinda, tell us a little bit about Mala, about what you've been doing the past few years.
Isabel, it's so nice to talk to you, and so nice to be in this room, in this virtual room with you. I haven't seen you.
I know.
Right? Because we've been separated after pandemia. So thank you for that beautiful introduction. I guess what I would add is in 2019, I was awarded, it's something like a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Elliot Norton Awards in Boston. It's the Boston Theater Critics Association. And for my body of work.
Mm-hmm.
And then my Zoom play, which I wrote during the pandemic, The Black Beans Project, just won Best New Play. And that is a play, it's a half brother and a half sister. Ella es cubana and he's Boricua. And they meet over Zoom to cook a pot of black beans together. And the audience can cook along with them. But also to work through some family business. You know, they're pulling skeletons out of the closet, and it's a sweet comedy. It's a really lovely comedy. So I'm currently working on an adaptation of Twelfth Night, which I mean, I want to center immigration, and I think I'm going to be setting it during El Mariel. So that's another Cuba, but. Yes, and I currently am a professor of the practice at Northeastern University, and I'm a playwright, and I'm the artist in residence at the Huntington Theater. I'll stop there.
But you haven't said anything about what you've done with Mala, because you were in California performing.
That's right. So I just performed. I spent 6 weeks at the Old Globe Theater in California with Mala. That is a one-person show. It's a long monologue, a full-length monologue. And what was wonderful about that was we had an English language production and a Spanish language production. And so that theater in San Diego is the first time that they were creating theater exclusively for a Spanish language audience, and a totally new and different audience than what they are usually have in the theater. We had another actress there. My Spanish is good, but it wasn't quite good enough to do the whole show in Spanish. So this wonderful performer, Yadira Correa, she did the Spanish language shows. And so I got to see it.
So you got to the distance. That must be incredible.
It was really fun.
One woman play.
Yeah. And it was so much better in Spanish. I just loved it. It was, but you know, it's muy cubano. It's really Cuban, that play, and I didn't realize it until I heard it in Spanish, and I was like, that's what I was doing. And so I guess I'll add, you know, my director, David Dower, who's also bilingual. Él es americano, pero es bilingual. He lived in Mexico for many years, and what he said was, I write in Spanish in English. That's how he characterized my work. And I really like that. I like thinking about my work that way. It's not just the themes that I'm interested in, which is bicultural, and it's very much about being a person of two places, a person of two homes, a person of two cultures, of two languages, and the diaspora that many Cuban Americans have experienced, right? Trying to make sense of that. It's not just those themes that are interesting to me, it's also how we use language. And when you speak two languages, or you're used to a rhythm in Spanish and then you put it in English, it just sounds a little different in English. It's not quite English, it's a little bit different. I write in English or sometimes Spanglish. And then we had a translation done, and the actors, Yadira and Jerry, who is Mexicano, they worked really hard on that translation and on making that translation just very Cuban. And you had mentioned my play Sonia se fue, Sonia flew, and Becoming Cuba, Ser Cuba. They are also both available in Spanish.
So I'm going to start with that question. Can you tell us a little bit about Sonia se fue? Not a lot, but a little. And what made you write that play? Because that's how you became very well known in Boston. So tell us a little.
So that play has been done everywhere. It's very nationally recognized. I mean, I think I've had productions in probably at least 30 states. It was I did a translation of it in Cuba, in Camagüey, at the Cuban National Theater Festival, and that is a play. I was so many So in 2000, I was living in Miami for a time, and I came to know about the Pedro Pan Exodus, where 14,000 unaccompanied children were sent out of Cuba at the beginning of the revolution by parents who were very afraid of what was coming. And what I learned is that I had a cousin who had been sent by her mother in Havana to an orphanage in Denver, where she spent 4 years waiting for her mother to come and get her. And I hadn't heard about this historical event, and I was very affected by it. And I talked with my cousin about her experience, and she said, after that, I'm not afraid of anything. And she's this incredibly accomplished person. She's a brave, strong, amazing Cuban success story. And I just got very interested in you know, what there's one side of the success, and there's also the other side of the success. And right about that time, I had a child, and so I suddenly thought, well, what would it take for me to give up, put my daughter on a plane and not know if I was going to see her again? It was very personal. And so I wrote the play. It's 2 acts. The first act is present day in the United States. And we meet Sonia, whose son has just enlisted in the Marines. It's shortly after 9/11. And Sonia has a very emotional, irrational response to her son signing up in the US military. And it breaks that family apart. And the second act, we see Sonia at 15 in Cuba, and her parents wrestling with the decision of how to it's 1961. It's just before the invasion of Bay of Pigs. And before things really get clamped down, and what you come to see is Sonia's family deciding to send her away. And the play tries to make sense of the emotional trauma, the rupture of losing your home, especially when it isn't your decision.
It goes very well for teaching it. The students really understand. As I have taught this play in my classes, and you come in as guest,
right? And
it's very understood that emotions of Sonia as a woman, grown woman, remembering her experience. So that was excellent. How about becoming Cuba? Because then there was a big pause there between 2004 when you wrote Sonia Flew and becoming Cuba, which was 2014.
Yeah.
So I wrote a little tiny bit about that.
I had several other plays. I wrote a rock musical, Gary. I wrote a ghost story called Caroline in the City. So I wrote several different plays in between that time. But so becoming Cuba, we have a legend in my family about my bisabuela, Mama Juana, who was a 16-year-old girl during the Cuban War of Independence, la lucha contra España, and eventually becoming Cuba and Spain and the United States. Pero the story is that the Spanish were rounding up all the country folk and putting them into camps, right? And then torching the land so that the Mambisas didn't have any food. That was the Spanish kind of pioneering the idea of a concentration camp, and many, many, many Cubans died at that time. And the story goes that when they came to Mama Juana's finca, and her family was going, she said, "No, I'm not going." And she left home at 16, and she went into the Sierra. And she lived with the Mambisas, and she lived with the revolutionaries there, and then eventually after the war came back. And so I had this character, right? Sometimes you get an idea from history, or you get an idea from a person, or you hear a story. And so I didn't write her story, but I imagined a woman who's half Spanish and half Cuban. And she runs a pharmacy in La Habana. And so I started writing about how her loyalties change from thinking that she is Spanish to understanding that she is Cuban, and making the decision to leave everything she knows to go and to go and fight for independence.
Would you say that those years between 2004, 2014, you yourself were trying to figure out identity, right?
Yeah.
Because this character in the 2014 play is really trying to figure out, who am I? Am I Spanish? Am I Cuban? And you, Melinda, the writer, is trying to figure out, what am I? Am I American? Am I Cuban? Am I Latina? Because this Latina thing here, you know, that too.
Yeah.
So in between those years, you were thinking, but you weren't writing about Cuba, right? Though between 2004, 2014.
Well, you know what's really interesting? I've had a lot of conversations about my work, and no one's ever actually said that to me so clearly. Isabel, like you know something about me, and
I'm a little ESP. I have ESP.
You have ESP. So I was thinking about this play, and I thought, well, I can't write it because I've never been to Cuba. Why am I trying to write a play set in Cuba? I don't know anything about it. I had never been there, and I was I was about to abandon it, and I like literally got a phone call from a friend who runs a humanitarian aid organization that sometimes they travel to Cuba, and she said, we have a trip leaving next week and someone can't go. Do you want to go? And it was like that. It was so fast. And so that was my first trip to Cuba, was when I was thinking about this play. And actually going to Cuba, I came back and I wrote the play. So I went, I had this idea of a pharmacy, and then in Havana, there are several very well preserved. This is actually from a museum, el Museo de la Farmacia. It's in Old Havana, and you'll see in the picture. It's this, it's this beautifully preserved, very old world pharmacy, and I thought that's it. I mean, I already had it in my head, but then when I saw it, I knew it.
And you reproduced it on stage, because that was wonderful.
But your question about, your question about identity and trying to grow into who you are, because I don't think it's necessarily that you're picking one or the other, and sometimes one is more present, but I think it's also growing into the fullness of and the complexity of who you are when you're the child of immigrants, or you're an immigrant yourself, or you're adopting a new world, or even though the United States is mostly the world I know, where I grew up, the influences from my parents and their experiences of not being American and becoming American and living, that gets into your skin. And and of course, being in Cuba, I'm not Cuban. And I don't even calling myself Cuban American. I think I'm Cuban American because my parents are Cuban, but I wasn't born there. I didn't come from there. So is that even the right term? And Latino, Latina.
I don't know. You sound pretty Cuban when you speak Spanish. You sound really Cuban.
But I think, creative practice, if you're a writer, you're a poet, you're a songmaker, you make ceramics, right? It's about telling stories. Even in a painting, you're telling a story. And so there's something about that discipline of going deep into yourself and thinking, settling into a place where you can imagine worlds. And of course, those worlds are only populated by things that you know and can imagine. So even the most foreign world is still part of you. And so what happens in that world? I'll also say, I think Cuban American playwrights are just always really interesting. From Maria Fornes and Nilo Cruz, and there's a lot of intense emotion. There's a lot of humor. There's a lot of beauty. So I'm very interested in what people from our culture have to say about how they move through the world.
And how did you feel when you're talking continuing in this line of identity, when you went to Camagüey, and your plays were right there. I
Yeah.
mean, can you lead us into that story a little bit, and how did you come to have your plays be set there?
Yeah. So I made a connection with a wonderful scholar, Lillian Mansour, who is at the University of, she's in Miami at the university, right. And through her, I was connected with a number of theater makers in Cuba. And I also met a wonderful translator, Alberto Sarrain, who's Cuban. He, he was a theater maker in Cuba for many, 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 many years. And so he did a terrific translation. And then we got to talking, and this theater festival was coming. And so we partnered with a theater company in Havana to do a reading of the play, Sonia Flew, which is set in the two worlds. And so, of course, one was, I was very aware, this was 2018. And I was very aware that there were more intense vigilando artists, and there was starting to be much more censorship and much more concern about artistic work in Cuba. And so I had some anxiety about that, but I think it was really my own anxiety.
No, it wasn't your own. I mean, it goes on there.
So there was that, because there are things in that play that are very pointedly, I can look at it now and say they're very pointedly anti-communist. But so I was hyper aware of it there. And I was also, I wrote that the scenes set in America are better. The scenes set in Cuba, I'm trying to explain Cuba to an American audience, right? I'm trying to explain what life under a dictatorship is to a community of people who have never lived it, right? Assuming that the play is
not yet.
Boston, not yet. Well, 2018 too, right? So there are things dramaturgically that are not necessary if the play is done in Cuba, right? And so I was also very aware of that. So I was seeing a lot of places where I wished the play was better. But what was really interesting was, we had a talk back afterwards and a conversation afterwards, and there were many people, older people, who were very moved by the play, very affected by the play. And for them also, in part, it's that experience of knowing that your country's children were lost to you, right? The United States got the benefit of all those families, and Cuba lost all those families. And so it's a different kind of experience for a patriot of either country, right? I think you can be a Cuban patriot and you can be an American patriot, and you're going to experience that play in a different way. The other thing was that I just think theater makers and theater lovers were, they were moved that they saw the two countries on stage in one play, and that they were very happy to know that there were writers who were trying to make bridges. That's what I don't know how, how idealistic that is, but I do think that artistic work can create bridges, in maybe in a better moment than right now.
Well, talking about bridges, Obama talked about your work. How did that all happen? And can you tell us briefly how he mentioned Melinda Lopez in national television, right?
Well, it was the address from El Teatro in La Habana. It was his huge, enormous speech that was to the world, saying, we're doing this. The United States and Cuba are gonna get together, right? And so that my first trip in 2011, when I went, I went with a group that I volunteer with, Friends of Caritas Cuba. And I had an opportunity to try to find my family home.
Mhm.
We were very close to where my parents are from, and I was able to go out for the day, and I took a taxi cab ride out, and I had a very remarkable 24 hours where the things that only happen in Cuba happened to me, meeting the person who could take you to the person. And, when I had asked my parents, I'd said, Papi, I'm going to Cuba. Will you tell me where I can find your house in the distillery, Abuelos Fábrica? And he was like, oh, you just ask cualquier viejo por ahí, ¿dónde está la casa de Miguel López? And they'll know, right? That's what he said.
¿En
And
qué pueblo? ¿En qué pueblo era ese?
Caibarien.
Caibarien.
Yes, that's exactly, the short version. I mean, you asked me about Obama. Anyways, I came back to my group and I was like, oh my God, all these things happened. And I met the woman who my mother played with, and she had my baby picture, like all this crazy. And so our founder, Friends of Caritas Cuba, the founder, she remembered that story. And so she was in communication with Obama's people when they were looking for anecdotes and stories for the president to talk about how our countries can be, I don't know, how our countries and our cultures can communicate.
Mhm.
And so I was in, a lot of people were, please send us, if you have an anecdote, send us a story. And I wrote it down in an email very quickly, and I sent it off to whoever. And I guess his speechwriters thought it did something that the speech needed. So I didn't know any of that. I just sent an email, and like 3 months later, I knew he was in Havana. And I stayed home from work that day because I wanted to watch the whole speech. And I did something I never do, which is I turned my phone off. And I sat in front of the TV, and I no distractions. I'm going to watch the whole thing. And that speech is about an hour and a quarter, right? It's like 75 minutes. It's long. And I was crying, loving the speech and everything. And then this section is about an hour and 10 minutes in. So it's almost at the end. And he said my name. And he talked about that, talked about making the connection in Cuba the way I did. And I still can't, it was the most beautiful sound to hear him say your name. Anyway, that was my experience. I was very moved to hear that voice say my name. And what was interesting was my family in Cuba also heard it. And so at that point we were still, emailing, we could still communicate via Facebook. And so I knew that Cubans had heard the speech, which was also really beautiful.
Yes. So that takes us to your last or more current Cuban work, which is Mala. Tell us a little about Mala. And I mean, I saw you in the Emerson Theater do this, and I don't know about the Spanish version, but the English version is amazing.
Yeah.
Don't say you're not. This wasn't good, because it was very powerful, very powerful.
So Mala is based on my experience caring for my mother at the end of her life. My parents lived with me. We have a house with an apartment, and they lived with my husband, my spouse, and me for many years. And and I was very close with my mother, and I spent a lot of time supporting her and helping her as she got older and older until she needed more care. And so part of it was recognizing that process and how we talk about death and dying in our country, in this culture, which we don't do very well. And also the complexity of having a mother who's fuerte, Cubana, who wants things the way she wants them, and me too, and knowing that you shouldn't be fighting, and yet you can't not fight because it's how you communicate, and the level of right? Wishing that you could do things better. And so a lot of my work in its specificity tends to speak to a more universal audience. And, mala is the word that this mother calls this daughter, right? She calls her mala because she won't let her do the thing, or she says you have to do, that she's trying to help, but she's mala. And like, as Cubanas, everyone goes like, oh, that word, I know what that word is. But culturally, I had audience members who were Chinese, South Asian, Greek, Israeli, saying to me, this is my story. This is my story with my family. Your family's just like my family. And so I hear that a lot about my work, that in the specificity of the Cuban American immigrant, first generation fracaso, many cultures see themselves, and I also think, I think even pure blood American, pilgrims
Can relate.
probably have the same, experience. So yes, I've performed Mala a number of times, but it's also been performed with different artists. So it isn't just my story. It's a play that's constructed as this character comes to understand that really the thing that she needs to do is sit in the room with her mother and look out the window and listen to the birds, and that all this sort of trying to push away what's inevitable, like at some point you have to just let that go and be present with your loved one, and take the time that you have left with them.
Do you feel that in your own experience you did that, or did you write it because you didn't do that?
Yeah, I didn't.
Nobody ever does. I have, when I was looking at you doing that, I was thinking of my own experience with my mother, and it was that. Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do this? I should have let it go. I didn't want it to happen. So I was like trying to avoid the fact that it was going to happen. And you can, because it's coming. And you should let them go into it in a more, I don't know. I think that's upsetting to them.
Even like, I would talk to my sister and I would say, we should probably talk to them about what they want. And she was like, yes, we should talk to them about what they want. And then we couldn't do it. We knew, and we couldn't. And I wanted the play to offer an audience the opportunity to walk out of the theater and say, that was amazing. What a story. Maybe we'll talk about it now, right? That maybe the play is the wedge that can help a family say, before, like, what is it that you imagine? What would you like? How would you like the end of your life to go? If you're that fortunate to have that choice, if you're fortunate enough to have that choice. And I also, my experience was that being a caretaker was so isolating and so lonely. And yet so many people experience it. And so we're all experiencing it alone in isolation. And I wanted the play I wanted people to see that, to know that they were seen, right? I mean, I think we're drawn to art that sees us. Like, we think that we're going to see a play or see a character or see a movie, but I think what we want is to be seen. We want a character that we recognize as someone like an experience that we've had. I see myself there, and and they're seeing me.